The morning mist clung to the red clay hills of Sanh like a funeral shroud. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien crouched in his foxhole on Hill 861, squinting through the haze at the tree line below. Something was wrong. The usual symphony of jungle sounds, chattering monkeys, crying birds, rustling leaves had fallen silent. In Vietnam, silence meant death was coming. Mortar rounds screamed down from the hills, turning the Marine outpost into a hellscape of flying dirt, twisted metal, and screaming men. Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, found themselves under the heaviest bombardment they had ever experienced. The North Vietnamese Army's 304th Division had finally revealed itself. After weeks of shadowy movement in the surrounding jungle, Captain William Dabney, commanding the hill position, pressed himself against the sandbags as shrapnel whined overhead. "This isn't a probe," he shouted to his radio operator over the thunderous explosions. "This is the real thing." The young Marine, barely 19, fumbled with the radio handset, his hands shaking as he tried to establish contact with Sanh combat base below. Colonel David Lones, commander of the 26th Marine Regiment, received the transmission in his bunker at the main base. Through the crackling static, Dabney's voice carried the weight of desperate urgency. 300 North Vietnamese soldiers were assaulting Hill 861 in human waves, their AK-47 rifles chattering like deadly typewriters. This was no ordinary attack. It was the opening move in what would become one of the longest and most brutal sieges in American military history. The Sanh combat base, situated just 6 miles south of the demilitarized zone, had become a strategic obsession for both sides. General von Nguyen Giap, the legendary North Vietnamese commander who had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu 14 years earlier, saw an opportunity to repeat history. He had positioned for entire divisions over 20,000 battle-hardened troops in the mountains, surrounding the isolated Marine base. For President Lyndon Johnson and General William Westmoreland, Sanh represented a crucial anchor point preventing North Vietnamese infiltration into South Vietnam's populated areas, as documented by military historians at the Air Force Historical Foundation. On the morning of the 21st of January 1968, People's Army of Vietnam PAVN forces made their first attacks on the United States Marine Corps outpost at Sanh. What followed was a 77-day siege whereby no one could get in or out. The Marines of the 26th Regiment, 6,000 strong, suddenly found themselves cut off from the outside world, surrounded by an enemy force more than 3 times their size. Supply lines were severed, and the only lifeline remaining was the narrow airstrip that ran through the heart of the base, like a concrete river of hope. As the first day of the siege wore on, the scope of the North Vietnamese commitment became terrifyingly clear. Artillery pieces hidden in caves along the Co Roc Mountains, just across the border in Laos, began a relentless bombardment that would continue for the next 7 to 7 days. Each shell that screamed overhead carried with it the promise of death, and each Marine who dug for cover wondered if this would be the one with his name on it. The battle for Sanh had begun, and for the young Americans trapped within its perimeter, the world had suddenly shrunk to the size of a foxhole, where survival was measured not in days or hours, but in heartbeats between the whistling incoming rounds. The stench of cordite and fear permeated every bunker, every trench, every desperate hiding place within the Sanh combat base. By the end of January, the Marines had realized the horrifying truth. They were completely surrounded. General Giap's master plan was unfolding with methodical precision, and the ring of North Vietnamese steel was tightening around them like a noose. Lance Corporal Tony Martinez hugged his M16 rifle as another barrage of 122mm rockets screamed overhead. He, 20-year-old from East Los Angeles, had been in country for 8 months, but nothing had prepared him for this. The enemy wasn't playing by the usual rules of hit-and-run guerrilla warfare. This was conventional warfare at its most brutal, a siege designed to crush the defenders. Through sheer weight of firepower and psychological pressure, Colonel Lones paced the floor of his command bunker, studying intelligence reports that painted an increasingly grim picture. North Vietnamese regulars from the 304th, 320th, 324th, and 325th Divisions had been identified in the surrounding hills. These weren't teenage farmers with outdated weapons. These were seasoned soldiers, equipped with modern Soviet artillery, mortars, and anti-aircraft guns. The psychological warfare began almost immediately. During the brief lulls between bombardments, the North Vietnamese would broadcast propaganda messages through loudspeakers hidden in the jungle. Marines of Sanh, the tinny voice would echo across the base in accented English. "You are surrounded and cut off. Your government has abandoned you. Surrender now and you will be treated humanely. The Marines responded with their own form of psychological warfare, obscene gestures, and creative profanity that would have made their drill instructors proud. But the real terror came from the constant artillery barrage. North Vietnamese forward observers, positioned on the high ground overlooking the base, could direct fire with deadly accuracy on any target they chose. The Marines learned to move in short, desperate sprints from one position to another, never knowing when the next salvo would turn their world into flying metal and fire. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Robert Hayes worked frantically in the aid station, treating an endless stream of casualties, shrapnel wounds, concussions, and cases of what the doctors euphemistically called combat fatigue filled every available bed. The young Navy medic had volunteered for duty with the Marines because he believed in making a difference. Now, as he worked to save the life of yet another teenager whose war had ended before it really began, he wondered if anyone back home truly understood what was happening in this forgotten corner of hell. The supply situation grew more desperate by the day. Every attempt to bring in supplies by truck convoy along Route 9 had been met with devastating ambushes. The North Vietnamese had positioned anti-aircraft guns throughout the hills, making helicopter resupply extremely dangerous. Only the most skilled pilots dared attempt landings at Sanh, and even they could only come in during brief windows when the incoming fire lessened. Captain James Pipes, a veteran transport pilot flying C-130 cargo planes, described the approach to Sanh as threading a needle while riding a roller coaster in an earthquake. The runway, barely 2,500 feet long and constantly cratered by mortar fire, required split-second timing and nerves of steel. More than one aircraft had been destroyed on approach, turning into fireballs that served as grim reminders of the price of keeping the Marines supplied. The nights were the worst. In the absolute darkness of the Vietnamese highlands, every sound became amplified, every shadow a potential threat. North Vietnamese infiltrators probed the perimeter constantly, testing for weak points, cutting communication lines, and keeping the defenders in a state of constant alertness. Sleep became a luxury that few could afford, and those who did manage to doze did so with their weapons clutched in their hands. As February approached, the Marines of Sanh began to understand that this was no ordinary battle. This was a test of endurance, will, and courage that would determine not just their own fate, but possibly the outcome of the entire Vietnam War. In Washington, President Johnson had become obsessed with the siege, demanding hourly upgrades and vowing that Sanh would not become America's Dien Bien Phu. The pressure was mounting on all sides, and the young Marines trapped in their foxholes were about to become pawns in a game far larger than any of them had ever imagined. While the Marines at Sanh counted mortar rounds and rationed water, General Giap was orchestrating one of the most audacious military deceptions in modern warfare. Unknown to the Americans fixated on the siege, the attack on Sanh was an elaborate feint of bloody magician's trick, designed to draw attention away from the real target. On the morning of January 30th, as Colonel Lones received reports of increased enemy activity around his perimeter, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched simultaneous attacks on over 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive had begun, and the world's attention suddenly shifted from the isolated hills of Sanh to the streets of Saigon, Hue, and dozens of other urban centers. But for the Marines trapped in their bunkers, the revelation that they might be part of an elaborate diversion did nothing to diminish the very real threat they faced. If anything, it intensified their sense of isolation and abandonment. Sergeant First Class David McMurray, a career Marine from Tennessee, expressed the sentiment of many when he muttered to his squad, "Whether we're the main event or the sideshow doesn't matter much when those rockets are coming down on our heads." The intensity of the bombardment increased dramatically during the first week of February. North Vietnamese artillery observers, now clearly visible on the surrounding hills, directed a methodical destruction of everything within the base perimeter. The ammunition dump exploded on February 5th, sending shock waves that could be felt for miles and lighting up the night sky like a man-made sunrise. The blast destroyed over 1,500 tons of ammunition and supplies that the Marines could not afford to lose. Captain Kenneth Pipes, commanding Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, watched helplessly as his defensive positions were systematically pounded into rubble. "They're not trying to overrun us," he reported to Colonel Lones during one of the brief communication windows. "They're trying to grind us down, one bunker at a time." The psychological toll was becoming as devastating as the physical damage. Marines who had survived firefights in the jungle without flinching now jumped at shadows, and dove for cover at the sound of friendly aircraft overhead. Combat fatigue, what earlier generations had called shell shock, was claiming as many casualties as enemy fire. Dr. Edward Feldman, the chief medical officer, reported that nearly 30% of the garrison was showing signs of severe stress-related disorders. Yet in the midst of this hell, remarkable acts of heroism emerged daily. When Lance Corporal James Patterson was wounded while attempting to repair communication lines during a barrage, Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class Michael O'Malley crawled 50 yards under direct fire to reach him. With mortar rounds exploding all around them, O'Malley dragged Patterson to safety, administered first aid, and then crawled back out to retrieve the wounded Marine's equipment. Such actions became routine rather than exceptional, as the siege forged bonds of brotherhood that would last lifetimes. For those lucky enough to survive, the resupply situation had become critical. Air Force C-130 aircraft, flying in through walls of anti-aircraft fire, could only deliver supplies during brief windows when the weather cleared enough for instrument approaches. Many times, pilots would make their approach only to discover that enemy fire had cratered the runway again, forcing them to abort their landing and return to base with desperately needed supplies still in their cargo holds. Colonel Lones made the difficult decision to implement strict rationing. Water was limited to 2 canteens per day per man, barely enough in the tropical heat. Food became a luxury. Sea rations were divided between 2 or 3 Marines, and hot meals became a memory from a more civilized time. "We're living like cavemen," wrote Private First Class William Rodriguez in a letter to his mother in Chicago. "But we're still Marines, and we're still fighting." The most disturbing development was the growing evidence of North Vietnamese tunnel construction. Engineering teams detected vibrations that suggested extensive digging operations around the perimeter. The possibility that the enemy might be following the same tactics that had worked at Dien Bien Phu, digging trenches and tunnels ever closer to the defensive positions, haunted the command staff. Every night, listening posts reported the sound of shovels and picks working steadily in the darkness, like the sound of graves being dug. As February progressed and the siege entered its 3rd week, the Marines of Sanh faced a grim reality. They were running out of everything except enemy fire. The question was no longer whether they could hold the base, but whether anyone would be left alive to be relieved when help finally arrived. The thunder that rolled across the mountains surrounding Sanh wasn't from storm clouds. It was the sound of American air power unleashing hell on Earth. President Johnson, determined that Sanh would not fall, had authorized the largest concentrated bombing campaign in the history of warfare. Operation Niagara was about to turn the hills of northern South Vietnam into a moonscape of destruction. General William Westmoreland, commanding all American forces in Vietnam, stood in his Saigon headquarters staring at a map dotted with red pins representing enemy positions. "Gentlemen," he addressed his staff officers, "we are going to pound those bastards until there's nothing left but smoking craters." The general's confidence masked his private fears. That Giap might indeed be attempting to recreate his triumph over the French 14 years earlier. For the Marines trapped in their bunkers at Sanh, the arrival of massive air support was both salvation and additional terror. B-52 Stratofortresses, flying so high they were invisible to the naked eye, began dropping strings of 750-pound bombs along the perimeter in formations called arc-light strikes. The explosions were so powerful they lifted Marines clear off the ground, even when the bombs landed hundreds of yards away. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien, still manning his position on the scarred remains of Hill 861, felt the earth shake as another arc-light strike pounded the North Vietnamese positions. "It's like living through the end of the world," he wrote in his diary. Except the world keeps ending every few hours. The constant bombardment had left him and his men in a state of semi-conscious stupor, able to function, but unable to process the full horror of their situation. The statistics were staggering. American aircraft were flying over 300 sorties per day. In support of Sanh, fighter bombers dropped napalm, high-explosive bombs, and cluster munitions on anything that moved in the surrounding hills. Artillery bases throughout South Vietnam turned their guns northward, firing over 100,000 rounds in support of the besieged Marines. The firepower being directed at the hills around Sanh exceeded anything used in World War II, including the preparatory bombardments for D-Day. But the North Vietnamese had not spent months preparing their positions without considering American air power. Deep bunkers carved into the mountainsides provided protection from all but direct hits. Supply tunnels ran for miles underground, allowing the movement of men and materials despite the constant bombing. Most importantly, the enemy artillery pieces were positioned in caves along the Khao Rock Ridge in Laos, technically off limits to American ground forces due to political restrictions. Captain William Dabney, still holding his hilltop position despite weeks of constant bombardment, received orders that reflected the desperation of the overall situation. His company was to conduct reconnaissance patrols to determine the effectiveness of the bombing campaign. This meant sending small groups of Marines outside the relative safety of their fortified positions to walk through areas that had been carpet bombed for weeks. The first patrol, led by Sergeant First Class Raymond Thompson, returned with disturbing news. Despite the massive bombing campaign, North Vietnamese forces were not only still present, but appeared to be growing stronger. Fresh troops were moving into positions daily, and new artillery pieces were being brought up from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The bombing was spectacular, but not decisive, a fact that would have profound implications for American strategy throughout the war. The strain on the Marines was becoming unbearable. In addition to the constant incoming fire and the psychological pressure of being surrounded, they now had to endure the deafening noise and concussion effects of their own massive air support. Many Marines reported temporary or permanent hearing loss from the constant explosions. Others showed signs of what medical personnel described as sensory overload syndrome, an inability to process the overwhelming assault on their nervous systems. Yet morale remained surprisingly high. The arrival of massive air support, whatever its effectiveness against the enemy, proved to the Marines that they had not been forgotten. Letters from home, when they could be delivered, carried messages of support from a nation that was beginning to understand the magnitude of the sacrifice being made in the hills of Vietnam. Private First Class Anthony Russo, a 19-year-old from Brooklyn, perhaps best captured the paradox of their situation in a letter to his girlfriend. "The bombing is so loud. We can't hear each other talk, and so bright at night we don't need flashlights. It's beautiful and terrible at the same time. I know it sounds crazy, but I feel safer knowing that all those planes are up there dropping hell on the bad guys. At least somebody knows we're here." As Operation Niagara entered its second week, the question remained, would American firepower be enough to save the Marines of Khe Sanh, or would Giap's patient strategy of attrition eventually succeed in achieving what he had accomplished against the French at Dien Bien Phu? By early March, the siege of Khe Sanh had evolved into a deadly chess match played across the rugged hills surrounding the combat base. Each hilltop position became a castle to be defended, and each valley a killing ground where young men from both sides died for objectives measured in yards rather than miles. The most critical position was Hill 861 Alpha, held by Captain William Dabney's India Company. For over 40 days, his Marines had endured constant bombardment while maintaining their crucial observation post. Overlooking the base, the hill had been transformed from a jungle-covered knoll into a lunar landscape of shell craters, shattered trees, and hastily constructed bunkers that looked more like animal dens than military fortifications. Lance Corporal Miguel Santos crouched in what had once been a mortar pit, but now served as a mass grave for several of his buddies. The 21-year-old from New Mexico had watched his squad dwindle from 13 men to 4 over the course of the siege. Each morning, he would wake up if he had managed to sleep at all and check to see which of his remaining friends had made it through another night of incoming fire. The North Vietnamese strategy had become clear to Colonel Lones and his staff. They were systematically attacking the outlying positions, trying to force the Marines to either abandon the high ground or spread their forces so thin that the main base could be overrun. It was a strategy that required patience and a willingness to accept massive casualties. But Giap had demonstrated both qualities against the French. Hill 861 Bravo, held by a single platoon of Echo Company, came under sustained attack on March 2nd. North Vietnamese sappers, moving through the darkness like deadly shadows, penetrated the outer perimeter and destroyed the bunkers with satchel charges before being repelled. The attack cost the Marines 7 killed and 15 wounded casualties they could not afford from their already depleted ranks. But the most desperate fighting occurred on Hill 881 South, where Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, found themselves under siege within a siege, surrounded by North Vietnamese regulars who had infiltrated to within grenade range of their positions. The Marines fought a continuous battle that lasted 72 hours without pause. Captain James Graves, commanding Bravo Company, had been awake for 4 days straight when the final assault began. Through bloodshot eyes, he watched as human waves of North Vietnamese soldiers charged up the slopes of his hill, their AK-47 rifles chattering and their voices raised in battle cries that echoed across the valley. Fixed bayonets, he ordered his Marines, knowing that if the enemy reached their trenches, the battle would be decided with steel and courage rather than firepower. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. In trenches so narrow that men had to fight back-to-back, Marines and North Vietnamese soldiers grappled with knives, bayonets, and bare hands. The professional distance that soldiers tried to maintain between themselves and their enemies evaporated in the intimacy of personal combat. These were no longer faceless opponents, but individual human beings whose last breaths each fighter would remember forever. Hospital Corpsman Second Class Robert Hayes found himself treating wounded from both sides. During the brief lulls in fighting, the young Navy medic had long ago abandoned any consideration of nationality or ideology. Wounded meant wounded, and his job was to keep as many of them alive as possible. Working by the light of flares and muzzle flashes, he performed surgery with combat knives and administered morphine that had been airdropped in. During the previous day's resupply run, the arrival of reinforcements came not from the main base, which had no troops to spare, but from the sky. Marine helicopter pilots, flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire, managed to land just long enough to disembark small teams of volunteers who had requested permission to join the fight. These Marines, many of them clerks, cooks, and mechanics from rear area units, fought with the desperation of men who understood that their brothers were dying and that no one else was coming to help. The psychological impact of the hill fights extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For the first time since the siege began, the Marines had gone on the offensive, proving to themselves and their enemies that they were not simply victims waiting for rescue. The successful defense of Hill 881 South, achieved at the cost of 37 Marine casualties, demonstrated that American fighting spirit remained unbroken despite weeks of constant bombardment. As March progressed and the siege entered its 7th week, both sides began to show signs of exhaustion. North Vietnamese attacks, while still frequent and violent, lacked the coordination and intensity of earlier. The hill fights had proven one crucial point. The siege of Sanh would not be decided by grand strategy or overwhelming firepower, but by the individual courage of young men, willing to die for their fellow warriors in forgotten corners of a faraway war. The human spirit, like a piece of steel, can bend under pressure for only so long before it reaches its breaking point. By mid-March, the Marines at Sanh had endured nearly 60 days of constant bombardment, and the psychological casualties were mounting as rapidly as the physical ones. The question was no longer whether they would break, but when and whether their enemies would break first. Colonel David Lone stood in his command bunker, studying the latest casualty reports with growing concern. His effective fighting strength had been reduced to fewer than 4,000 Marines, and many of those were walking wounded who refused evacuation. The base had taken over 1,200 direct hits from rockets, mortars, and artillery shells. Every building above ground had been destroyed, and his men were living like moles in an underground city of bunkers connected by trenches. The most disturbing reports came from his company commanders, who were documenting an alarming increase in what the medical staff euphemistically called non-battle injuries. Marines were accidentally shooting themselves in the foot, walking into minefields during routine patrols, and in some cases simply curling up in their bunkers and refusing to respond to orders. The human mind, it seemed, could absorb only so much horror before it began shutting down in self-defense. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien had been at Sanh since the siege began, and the change in his men was obvious to anyone who cared to look. The eager young Marines who had arrived in Vietnam full of patriotic fervor and military pride had been replaced by hollow-eyed survivors who moved like old men and spoke in whispers. They had seen too much death, absorbed too much fear, and endured too much pain to ever again be the boys they had once been. The supply situation had become critical beyond anything previously experienced. Air Force transport planes could no longer land on the cratered runway, forcing all resupply to be conducted by low-level parachute drops. Many of the supply pallets landed outside the perimeter, where they became the prize in deadly contests between Marine recovery teams and North Vietnamese patrols. Water was so scarce that Marines were collecting rainwater in their helmets and rationing their daily intake to less than a quart per man. But it was the psychological warfare that proved most effective in breaking down morale. The North Vietnamese had positioned loudspeakers throughout the hills surrounding the base, and they broadcast a continuous stream of propaganda designed to demoralize the defenders. "Your families have forgotten you," the electronic voices would taunt during the brief lulls between bombardments. "Your government has written you off as casualties. Surrender now and avoid the inevitable massacre." Captain William Dabney, still commanding his hilltop position, had watched several of his Marines crack under the pressure. Young Corporal had been found talking to imaginary friends and sharing his rations with soldiers who had been dead for weeks. Another had begun compulsively cleaning his rifle, disassembling and reassembling it hundreds of times per day, while muttering mathematical calculations that made no sense. The thin line between sanity and madness, Dabney realized, was being measured in hours rather than days. Yet even at their breaking point, the Marines continued to demonstrate the courage and loyalty that had sustained them through 2 months of hell. When Private First Class William Rodriguez was wounded during a mortar barrage, 4 of his squad mates risked their lives to carry him to the aid station. When Lance Corporal Tony Martinez was trapped in a collapsed bunker, his entire platoon spent 12 hours digging him out while under direct enemy fire. Acts of heroism, performed by men who had every reason to look out only for themselves, proved that the human spirit could endure even when the human mind began to fail. The breakthrough came not from American forces, but from intelligence reports indicating that North Vietnamese units were beginning to withdraw from their positions around Khe Sanh. Intercepted radio transmissions suggested that General Giap was pulling his forces back toward the Ho Chi Minh Trail, apparently satisfied that the siege had achieved its strategic purpose of diverting American attention from the Tet Offensive. The news was met with a mixture of relief and disbelief by the Marines who had survived the siege. After nearly 70 days of constant combat, the idea that their ordeal might be ending seemed good to believe. Many of them had mentally prepared themselves for death and found it difficult to readjust to the possibility of survival. Colonel Lones, ever the professional soldier, refused to celebrate prematurely. The siege isn't over until the last enemy soldier pulls back, he told his staff, and even then, we've got to be ready for them to change their minds and come back. It was the caution of a commander who had learned never to underestimate his enemy or take survival for granted. As March drew to a close and the siege entered its final week, the Marines of Khe Sanh prepared for what they hoped would be their deliverance, but feared might be their final battle. The sound that broke the morning silence on April 1st was not the familiar whistle of incoming artillery, but the rumble of diesel engines and the clank of tank treads on asphalt. After 7 days in hell, the Marines of Khe Sanh watched in amazement as the first elements of the relief column appeared on the horizon. Operation Niagara to the ground offensive to break the siege had finally arrived. Lieutenant Colonel John Mitchell, commanding the leading element of the 1st Air Cavalry Division, had driven his armored column up Route 9 through a gauntlet of abandoned North Vietnamese positions. The evidence of the massive bombing campaign was everywhere. Entire hillsides had been stripped bare of vegetation, and the landscape looked like the surface of an alien planet. What amazed Mitchell most was not the destruction, but the fact that anyone had survived it. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien stood on what remained of Hill 861, watching the relief column advance toward the base. After more than 2 months of seeing nothing but enemy movement in the valleys below, the sight of American armor was almost surreal. "I keep thinking I'm dreaming," he told Captain Dabney, who had survived the entire siege commanding his hilltop position. "Part of me doesn't believe this is really happening." The reunion between the besieged Marines and their rescuers was emotional in ways that military regulations never anticipated. Hardened combat veterans embraced like long-lost brothers, and men who had not shed tears during the worst of the bombardment found themselves crying openly as they realized their ordeal was finally over. The relief column brought more than just reinforcements, they brought proof that the outside world still existed and still cared about the men who had been defending an isolated outpost. In the middle of nowhere, Colonel David Lones, meeting with the relief commanders in his underground bunker, presented a final casualty report that told the story of the siege in stark numbers. The Marines had suffered 205 killed in action and 1,668 wounded, a casualty rate of over 30%. But they had held their ground against overwhelming odds and had tied down for North Vietnamese divisions that could have been used elsewhere during the Tet Offensive. The most remarkable discovery came when intelligence teams began examining the abandoned North Vietnamese positions. The enemy had constructed an elaborate network of bunkers, tunnels, and supply depots that stretched for miles in every direction. Some of the bunkers were sophisticated enough to include ventilation systems, sleeping quarters, and medical facilities. The siege of Khe Sanh had not been a desperate gamble, but a carefully planned operation that had required months of preparation. Yet for all their preparation and numerical superiority, the North Vietnamese had failed to achieve their primary objective. Khe Sanh had not become America's Dien Bien Phu. The Marines had not surrendered, and American resolve had not been broken. General Giap's strategic masterpiece had succeeded in diverting American attention during the Tet Offensive, but it had not delivered the knockout blow that might have ended American involvement in Vietnam. The evacuation of Khe Sanh began on June 19th, just 2 months after the siege was lifted. American commanders considered the defense of Khe Sanh a success, but shortly after the siege was lifted, decided to dismantle the base rather than risk similar battles in the future. The decision to abandon the base that so many had died to defend struck many of the survivors as a cruel irony, but it reflected the changing nature of the war and America's growing realization that static defense was not the answer to guerrilla warfare. As the helicopters lifted off from Khe Sanh for the final time, carrying the last of the Marines who had endured the siege, many of them looked back at the hills where they had faced death for 7 to 7 days. The base was already being systematically destroyed to prevent its use by the North Vietnamese, and smoke from the demolition charges rose into the sky like incense at a funeral. Lance Corporal Tony Martinez, one of the last Marines to leave, carried with him a small bag of red clay dirt from Hill 861. "I want to remember this place," he explained to his squad leader, "not because it was hell, but because we survived it together." It was a sentiment shared by many of the survivors, who understood that they had been tested in ways that few human beings ever experience, and had proven worthy of the trust their fellow Marines had placed in them. The siege of Khe Sanh officially ended on July 11, 1968, when the last American forces were withdrawn from the area. The battle had lasted 7 to 7 days and had cost both sides thousands of casualties. But for the Marines who survived it, the siege would last a lifetime in their memories, dreams, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of combat. In the end, the true story of Khe Sanh was not about grand strategy, political objectives, or military doctrine. It was about ordinary young Americans who found themselves in an extraordinary situation and responded with courage, loyalty, and sacrifice that honored the best traditions of their service and their country. They had endured 7 to 7 days in hell and had emerged not as conquerors, but as survivors who would carry the weight of their experience for the rest of their lives. The red hills of Khe Sanh returned to jungle within a few years, but the memory of what happened there would endure as long as Marines gather to remember their fallen brothers and the battles that tested their souls. This account draws upon extensive historical documentation, survivor interviews, and military records from the siege of Khe Sanh. The courage and sacrifice of all who served there, American and North Vietnamese alike, deserve to be remembered and honored.